that being said, what I want to do now is give a brief introduction to Dr. Gleb so that he can get started for this great presentation. So Dr. Gleb Suppression is an internationally recognized thought leader on a mission to protect leaders from dangerous judgment errors known as cognitive biases. And in addition to this type of work, he has published a number of different books. And also, you can see here a total of 550 articles and 450 interviews that are also published under Dr. Suppression's work. So he's very busy on this type of topic, and we're very excited to have him join us here tonight. And without any further ado, what I'm going to do is give Dr. Suppression the show. So I will stop sharing. And now, there.
All right, great. Well, welcome everybody. And let's talk about COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic adaptation and planning via neuroscience for IT professionals. There will be some heavy information. I'm just warning you in advance so that you can anticipate it will not be light information. Of course, talking about COVID-19 is never light, but some of the recent stuff that's come out on it makes it especially heavy. So let's talk a little bit about first how people responded. One of the most prominent entrepreneurs, of course, is Elon Musk. And Elon Musk is in the news right now for trying to open up that Tesla factory way ahead of guidelines and when they should be opened. But he's not been in the news for this sort of thing only right now. He also called coronavirus pandemic panic dumb in March 6, 2020. So when it was already becoming quite clear that it was going to be a serious issue in the United States. And of course, he has a wide following among IT professionals and other sorts of folks. So you could see that this got 1.7 million likes. On the March 20th, after the declaration of the national emergency here in the US by the White House, he tweeted that based on current trends, close to 0 new cases in the US by the end of April. Well, we have over 1 million cases, so clearly he's wrong on that. So he clearly underestimated the impact of the pandemic and is, I would say, very much still underestimating it when he's trying to open up his factories. So that's one kind of entrepreneur, very prominent, very big, new money, entrepreneurial technology, whatever. Let's talk to old money. Maybe old money didn't. What did old money think about this? Well, it doesn't get more old money than Goldman Sachs. How did Goldman Sachs respond to it? Goldman Sachs, of course, supports its clients in telling them how to invest, what kind of investments to make, and it gives financial analysis based on it. So it gave an estimate of US GDP growth in the second quarter on February 24th. When coronavirus was becoming a serious issue in Italy, it said that, well, because of the coronavirus pandemic, US growth will only be 2.7. So only 2.7 growth compared to its previous higher estimate. Then what happened 3 weeks later, March 15th? It cut this estimate to a 5% decline. 5% decline from 2.7 growth. This is a huge cut. This is 7.7% change in its estimate of GDP. Huge. And of course, clearly didn't give very good advice to its clients who estimated and invested based on 2.7% growth. But what happened 5 days later, March 20th? It said 24% decline. In 5 days, its estimate changed from a 5% decline to a 24% decline. Clearly, old money like Goldman Sachs didn't make very good predictions either. Unfortunately, most leaders, the vast majority of leaders, followed the predictions of either new money, like Elon Musk, or old money, like Goldman Sachs. So they were caught unprepared, they greatly underestimated their threat, and they turned to their emergency business continuity plans to address the situation. But these plans are not a good fit for the situation. I say this as someone who makes a lot of these plans. This is my expertise as a disaster avoidance expert, disaster management, risk management, decision making. I make a lot of business continuity plans. They're not a good fit for the situation. I know a number of ISACA members who focus on risk management. Folks I talked to, who I presented to, they also make business continuity plans. Not a good fit for the situation. Why? They're great for emergencies. They're wonderful for emergencies. They're meant for a situation like a blizzard or like, let's say Houston. Houston got flooded last year pretty badly. Businesses were out of commission for a week, 2 weeks. Those business continuity plans are great for that. COVID-19 is not that. It's not an emergency. It's like Houston got flooded and then stayed flooded. you should not function as though that's an emergency. It's a major disruption that changes our environment fundamentally. It's a slow-moving, high-impact, long-term threat. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And relying on business continuity plans is a bad idea. It leads to a lot of serious problems because you're running in emergency mode when you shouldn't be. Let's talk about facts about COVID-19. It's highly contagious, very contagious. Every infected person, based on recent research, infects about 2 to 3 other people on average. And the number of cases doubles every 3 to 6 days. So I know ISACA professionals are good at math, so you understand the problems of logarithmic expansion. Salespeople, not so good at math. It has to be really explained to them, but I'm not going to explain this in detail to you. Understand the problems. Risk of serious illness, pretty bad potential in terms of infection rate, speed. There's serious risk of illness. 10 to 20% of the people who get it are seriously ill, and that counts as asymptomatic cases. We know that about 50% of people at any time don't know they have COVID-19. They don't have symptoms, even though they're infectious. They get other people infected. Of the rest of the people, about 20 to 40% get seriously ill. So 10 to 20% of the whole total of people get seriously ill. And then half of the seriously ill, so 5 to 10% of all people who get ill, that includes asymptomatic people, need to get hospitalized. So it's much more deadly than the flu. Recent research shows that about 0.5 at the lowest bound to 1% at the higher bound die from COVID-19 with great hospital treatment. Great hospital treatment, most advanced hospital treatment, 0.5 to 1% die. And with the flu, it's about 1.1%, so about 5 to 10 times more deadly than the flu. We know there's much higher death rate for people over 60 and people in vulnerable categories with COVID-19, and there's no effective treatment. The most effective treatment we have so far is remdesivir, this drug, and what it does, as far as we know, is it reduces the time that somebody spends hospitalized from 15 days on average to 11 days on average. And that's good. It reduces the morbidity, the sickness, time of sickness. It reduces long-term damage. We don't know yet whether it reduces mortality, meaning whether somebody dies or not. And it reduces hospital load, but by a third, so less than a third. So it's not that wonderful. It's not a silver bullet by any means. Vaccine is a silver bullet. That's what we need to deal with COVID-19. That's the only effective solution. And human trials are needed to test the safety and effectiveness. A number of vaccines are in human trials. Now, in order to test safety, if you throw all the money possible, which we are throwing at COVID-19 for vaccine research, throwing tons of money at it, and you cut all the regulatory tape that's possible, really cut it as much as possible, the safety trials take about 4 months, and the effectiveness trials take about 8 months. And so that's estimated to take about a year. That's with all the regulation cut, all the money available, as opposed to the usual 4 to 5 years for a vaccine trial. Now, unfortunately, and this is just the reality of the situation, most vaccines don't make it through human trials, especially ones that were rushed into production, like let's say you've probably been hearing about the Moderna vaccine. That was in trials from something like mid-March. Now, that was rushed into production. And as you know, things that are rushed into production often have flaws. So now we recently discovered about 10 days ago that there's apparently a more lethal strain of COVID-19 than the first strain that was reported. And it's that first strain that was reported for which the Moderna vaccine was created. Now, this new, more lethal strain that was mutated, the Moderna vaccine might or might not be effective against it. We don't know. Hopefully it is. That would be wonderful. But it's quite possible that it's not. And that's what happens when you kind of rush things into production. So there's more reason to believe it's not going to be as effective as we hoped. It's unlikely in general that the first vaccines are successful. Now, what happens after a vaccine is ready? Well, the government has to coordinate the process of producing, distributing, and actually vaccinating people. Unfortunately, the government, at least in the US, has not been very effective in the early stages of the pandemic, from everything to producing testing, to organizing and coordinating state responses, to ensuring that there's good logistics, buying of healthcare supplies, personal PPE, you've heard that, the personal protective equipment, ventilators, so on. The US government has gotten very low marks from experts on logistics and healthcare for its response to COVID-19. So I don't estimate that there's a good chance that they'll be great at producing and distributing vaccines. So you have to understand that. Possible timelines. Let's think about timelines. There's an optimistic one, there's a moderate one, and there's a pessimistic one. Optimistic. It assumes that we get really lucky with the Moderna vaccine or one of the other vaccines that's rushed into production. So it's approved for mass production by summer of 2021. That's the year-long trial process. Then production, distribution, vaccination, we're assuming that the government shows a surprising excellent level of competence. A number of governments have shown that level of competence. For example, the South Korean government has done a really good job. The German government has done a really good job. The German government, by comparison, is a really good comparison. Germany is very diverse, very complex, very well developed country that is culturally in many ways similar to the US. But in terms of infection and deaths, it only has 7,000 deaths compared to over 80,000 in the US. So it's done a much better job in what it's doing. So we'll assume that high level of government competence, 6 months. So then you'll have most people vaccinated, which we know in order to get to herd immunity, you need to have about 60% of the people vaccinated, who are not going to pass on COVID-19 by early 2022. So let's say that all the vulnerable people over 60 and people with vulnerable health conditions. This is very low likelihood that we'll have by the start of 2022 this situation. I'd say it's less than 5%, just because of the reality. I mean, I gave you the math. Everything has to line up, all the ducks in a row, and the government has to be extremely competent. Then the moderate scenario. So the moderate scenario assumes that the first batch of vaccines is not going to succeed. Maybe the second batch will succeed, or the third batch will succeed. So it's approved by mass production by 2023. Now that I'm assuming a time range anywhere from late 2022 to late 2026, with late 2025 with 2023 as a midpoint for that. And then production, distribution, vaccination, we're assuming a moderate level of government competence, perhaps a little bit more competent than the government has shown right now. It'll take about a year for a moderate level of government competence. And so most people will be vaccinated by 2024. So this is the most likely scenario. That's that range from late 22 to late 26, with 2024 being the midpoint. That's 70%. Now, the pessimistic scenario. We might get unlucky. It might be much more tough to produce a vaccine than we hope for some reason or other. So in that case, we'll get a vaccine by 2026 that's approved and effective enough. Then production, distribution, vaccination, moderate level of competence takes a year. If it was pretty incompetent, maybe a year and a half, but let's say a year. So most people will be vaccinated by 2027. This is a realistic scenario. I'd say it's a 25% chance. I mean, you might think this is too cynical, this is too dark, but you know what? We still don't have an effective vaccine for the flu, and we've been battling the flu for over a century. The current vaccine we have is only 50% effective. That's not really enough. You cut COVID-19 death rates from 0.5 to 1% to 0.25 to 0.5%. That's still going to be huge. So that's not really going to be enough, unfortunately. Suppression is unfortunately the only top tactic we have available in the US, at least, given that we're not an authoritarian society. For example, in China, it was possible for them to put locks and chains on people's doors in Wuhan. It's not something, and have everybody download an app that traces their movements. That's not something we can do. In South Korea, people were voluntarily willing to undergo high level of surveillance. This is not something that people seem like they're willing to do. You've probably seen the recent protests. People don't seem like they're willing to do that in the US. So shutdowns and social distancing are the only tool that we have, unfortunately, terribly, to deal with COVID-19. That's in order to avoid overwhelming hospitals, because if you overwhelm hospitals, all the people who would need to go to the hospital will pretty much die. So you have the death rate shooting up by 10%, from 0.5 to 1% to 5 to 10%, like what happened in Italy. In Italy, it was actually the latest thing I saw when the hospitals were overwhelmed, it was close to 12%. So pretty bad. Suppression is extremely costly, hugely costly for the economy. It's very damaging, but it's effective. We know that aggressive suppression and some areas in the US had more aggressive suppression than others. So, for example, California had aggressive suppression, New York State had aggressive suppression. They were able to bring down the infection rate quite effectively. Ohio had pretty aggressive suppression. And a number of countries had pretty aggressive suppression, and they were able to bring down the COVID-19. Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, we know that. Unfortunately, once those countries started opening up, so let's say a recent example, South Korea started opening up, the number of cases increased. There was an incident traced where somebody went to a nightclub and partied with about a nightclub, pretty full, packed, went to 5 nightclubs in a night, was somebody who was sick with COVID-19. There were 5,200 people around this person in those really super packed nightclubs, and the number of them got sick, and then they started spreading COVID-19. So the government had to go and shut down the nightclubs and restaurants as a result of that. This is what we're facing. Realistically speaking, this is what we're dealing with. This is our future until widespread vaccination. We're seeing here in the US right now the loosening of restrictions in a number of areas. And we're already seeing an uptick of cases in many states that have loosened restrictions, for example, Texas and so on, Alabama. We're seeing that uptick in cases. And as a result, we'll eventually get tighter restrictions as the cases start approaching the numbers that would overwhelm medical systems, because no governor can really afford politically a situation that looks like New York City or looks like northern Italy, where you need refrigerated trucks outside of hospitals to hold bodies and mortuaries get overwhelmed. This is not going to be something that is politically viable here in the US. So there will be eventually tighter restrictions, followed by a decrease in cases. And that will be something that we're dealing with until vaccine, these repeating waves, tighter, more cases, tighter, less cases, looser, more cases. So we'll have to deal with various levels of social distancing, suppression, and so on for the next quite a while. This is not a short-term emergency. This will not blow over. This current reopening of the economy that we're having will not last. COVID-19 is a major disruption, and it will last, in the most optimistic scenario, until early 2022. That's less than a 5% chance. The world will change forever, just realistically. The world here in the US and around the world will change forever, because we're dealing with these waves of restrictions and loosenings. So people's habits, their values, their norms, their expectations, their behaviors, their desires, they will change. We'll never go back to January 2020, however hard that is to hear. And your role as a trusted advisor, so you and ISACA are the leaders in computer, in IT departments, leaders in auditing, leaders in risk management. Your role as a trusted advisor is to help the leaders who you advise realize the extent of this major disruption. That is your responsibility, because leaders overwhelmingly of companies, organizations, they tend to be too optimistic. And I know this, I work with leaders all the time and I need to hold their feet to the ground. You need to help them prepare for this uncomfortable reality. This is your responsibility as a trusted advisor. By doing so, it will benefit you and them. For them, it will help them accomplish their leadership goals, and they'll be very grateful eventually to you after you convince them of this situation and they accept the uncomfortable reality of the situation. It will help them accomplish their leadership goals in the long term, and it will build up you as a trusted advisor in their eyes. This is really important and valuable for you, of course. Don't plan for the most optimistic scenario. I want to highlight this. It's very tempting to go for early 2022. Too many companies they're thinking, it's going to all blow over by a couple of months, not even 2022. But you should not plan for early 2022. This will not happen. It's unlikely to happen by early 2022, very unlikely. Hope is not a strategy. It's a great quote attributed to Vince Lombardi, and that's a football coach, so that's something that your leaders will probably respect. You want to prepare for the moderate, or ideally prepare for the pessimistic scenario, and we'll talk about how to do that. Now, the pandemic is a slow-moving threat, and humans, just as human beings, we make really bad decisions about these sorts of things. We are not good at dealing with slow-moving threats. the ones that are unusual, slow-moving, because of how our brain is wired. And here we're getting into the neuroscience of it. Our gut reaction, our intuition, our feelings, our emotions, we underestimate such threats. It's just the way that we're built. And this leads to decisions that endanger our businesses and other organizations with which we're affiliated. Now, in order to help you understand where I'm coming from and my expertise to talk about this decision-making risk management, let me share a little bit more about me. My experience, clients, media, and books. My experience. So I've been doing this for over 20 years. The CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, consulting, coaching, and training firm, who've been helping clients in disaster avoidance, risk management, decision-making, and strategic planning. I've also spent 15 years in academia researching neuroscience and behavioral economics on these topics, published in a whole bunch of peer-reviewed venues like Behavior and Social Issues, Journal of Social and Political Psychology, and other high prominent venues, peer-reviewed venues. So that's my experience. Now, I've worked with a number of clients from innovative startups to Fortune 500 companies, as well as nonprofits and municipalities, so ranging from Aflac to Xerox. So that's part of my background. Then my media. So as Rob kindly mentioned, I've published in a whole bunch of venues, prominent venues like King, Time Magazine, CNBC, was interviewed in NPR, CBS News, published in Fast Company, Newsweek, Scientific American, and many, many more. Finally, my books. So I have 4 books, 4 best-selling books. Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters is the one I'm best known for, published by Career Press. And that's, of course, in business decision-making. The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, focuses on relationships, professional and personal. The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide. How do you help yourself accept reality, see reality accurately, accept reality when it's so uncomfortable, like around COVID-19, and help other people do so? And finally, my just published book, which hit the bestseller list, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. So that's my background, my thought leadership. All right, that's enough about me. Let's talk a little bit about decision-making, the cognitive neuroscience of it. Bad advice on decision-making is very common because of dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. They come from 2 related areas. Our evolutionary psychology, so how our brain has evolved because of the way that we are adapted. We're adapted, our intuition, our gut reaction, the older part of our brain, their feelings, our emotions are adapted for the savanna environment, not the modern environment. There are a number of important implications for COVID-19 and other decisions. And for generally how our brain is wired, the structure of our brain, and the way that we process information. Can't process too much information at a time, we get overwhelmed, and we make dangerous judgment errors as a result of the approach that we take to shortcuts. So for COVID-19, one of the really important things you need to realize in terms of decision-making is that we respond to threats with a fight or flight response. That's our main response to threats. It was great for our hunter-gatherer ancestors. That's what our lizard brain is adapted for. The risks that they faced were immediate and tense in the moment. Saber-toothed tigers, you might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response, where we have to jump at 100 shadows in order to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. Unfortunately, it's much, much, much worse to do that in the modern world. You might notice we have many less saber-toothed tigers. The risks we face are long-term, uncertain, ambiguous. They come from our email, from newsletters, from notifications on our cell phone. That's what the risks come from. And there are specifically 3 dangerous judgment errors, 3 cognitive biases that are most relevant to COVID-19. The normalcy bias, planning fallacy, and hyperbolic discounting. Normalcy bias has to do with how we feel about what is normal. In the savanna environment, it was important for us to feel like the world is not changing and to reject information about the world changing. There's a thunderstorm, it doesn't mean that the world will always be thunderstorming. Our world was mainly the same, it wasn't changing. So we assume, our gut intuition, our reaction is to assume that everything will keep going normally, there will be no major changes and disruptions, and this leads us to focus the short-term future, the next couple of years, as though it's going to be like the last couple of years. And as a result, we greatly underestimate the kind of disruptors that exist in the modern world. We underestimate their likelihood and their impact. Whether it's the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, it's very hard for us to viscerally accept that we're never going back ever to January 2020, and our world, even if we get a vaccine by early 22, has changed forever in very fundamental ways. It's very hard for us to accept that. Hard for me to accept that. Hard for me to, when I was learning about this information, I was sharing about it with my clients. It was hard for me to accept it. It was hard for them to accept it. So this is painful information. It's very important to accept the reality of this information. Otherwise, we're not really going to get anywhere if we, stick our heads in the sand like the mythical ostrich idea. But it's very hard to do. It's very painful, and I realize that, and it's been painful for me too. That's the normalcy bias, the planning fallacy. That's our pride in ourselves. So we feel proud of ourselves. We feel proud of our plans. We assume that the future will go according to plan. And that leads us to underestimate risks, problems, major disruptors like the COVID-19 pandemic, like the fiscal crisis of 2008, 2009, and much smaller things that cause our plans to go astray. We underestimate needed resources of time, money, information, social capital, strategic planning, and so on in order to make good plans. So we don't make good plans intuitively. Finally, hyperbolic discounting. In the savanna environment, it was very valuable for us to be oriented toward the immediate moment. If we killed a mammoth, we couldn't preserve the meat, so it was not very useful for us to how to orient toward preserving that meat. In the modern environment, of course, we can put our money in the bank, we can figure out what to do with our company, our organization. These are long-term establishments, but we really underestimate the importance of the long-term future and sacrifice it for the sake of the short term, like a number of companies and states and governors that are rushing to open up and sacrificing the reality of the long-term future, that they'll have much more economic pain because they're rushing to open up too fast. This is unfortunate. Some states, to be clear, are too slow. They are in a situation where they might well be able to open up, and they're not doing that. But most of the states, most of the problems are coming from states going too fast, not following the White House guidelines on when they should be opening up. That leads us to harming the long term and underestimating the long-term outcomes and impacts of what we're doing. These are the three biggest errors for COVID-19. Now, to overcome them, we need to go against our intuitions. Our intuitions, again, they helped human beings survive, but we are not wired to make good decisions intuitively in the modern world. And you know that from some areas, from physical fitness. When we come across a source of sugar in the ancestral savanna environment, it was important for us to eat as much of it as possible, honey, bananas, apples, in order to survive and thrive. We're the descendants of those who ate as much sugar as possible, otherwise we wouldn't have survived, and those who had a very strong fight or flight reflex, the ones that didn't die. In the modern environment, having all the sugar that you can get your hands on is not a good idea. They serve donuts. Donuts are served by the dozen, right? A box of dozen donuts. So if you get a box of dozen donuts, it's a bad idea to eat it by yourself in one sitting. Bad idea. But when you eat one donut, it really triggers you. It really gets you tempted to eat more and more and more. And then, before you know it, you're only seeing crumbs in the box. Not that I ever did it, right? Or if you get a gallon of ice cream, there's, a serving of ice cream is supposed to be 1 cup of ice cream, right? But if you eat 1 cup of ice cream, really, you're only going to eat 1 cup? I don't think so. Many people end up, I'm not talking, necessarily about myself, but potentially about myself, end up, eating half the jar of ice cream once they started. So it's very hard to stop once you start because we're triggered by sugar. And this is very difficult for us to deal with once we're triggered. It's much better, much healthier for us to have a healthier dessert in the first place, like a bowl of fruit. And we know that, and we try to do it, although we don't always succeed. There is a reason we're facing the obesity epidemic here in the US. But you've worked hard to try to have healthier eating habits, like eating fruit instead of donuts. It's hard to do, but that's what you need to do for your physical fitness. Unfortunately, people don't work on their mental fitness. It's even more important to have a healthy mind as to have a healthy body, I think, in the modern environment, given that we work with our mind much more than we work with our body, but we don't focus on it, and we don't work on addressing those dangerous judgment errors that cause us to make bad decisions. So let's talk a little bit about what the implications are of making good decisions about COVID-19, preparing. You need to make long-term, fundamental changes to your plans. You need to think years, not weeks. So not the business continuity plan, but fundamental changes to your business model, very basic changes for a future focused on virtual interactions. You don't want to yo-yo back and forth to the office when there's a restriction, loosening of restrictions. People are like, oh yes, let's go back to the office. It's tempting, but it's a bad idea because in a couple of months, you'll still need to go back home once there's going to be more harsh restrictions, and it's going to be more difficult for you to deal with that situation. Not to mention that you might get COVID-19 spread around the office. That's a very problematic situation. It's much better to make a commitment right now to only virtual interactions, virtual teams, virtual engagements. And you'll have a serious savings by giving up office space. A number of my clients have already broken their leases. It's only 2 months of their rent, first month and last month, and they're free of their lease, and they're saving a whole lot of money, and they're having their teams work at home. So that's a much better situation. So let's talk about virtual teams, virtual offerings, how you need to effectively adapt to COVID-19. There are 6 areas of changes to your internal business model that we'll go through. Cybersecurity, obviously, motivation, engagement, effective communication, conflicts, resolving them, cultivating trust, and accountability. Cybersecurity. This is an obvious one. I'm sure many of you know this, but I'm just going to highlight this. For those working from home are more vulnerable to cyber attacks. Why is this? Well, first of all, it's factual. We know the FBI has found that there's a lot more hacking going on right now than there was before the COVID-19 started. People are more vulnerable to cyber attacks for a number of reasons. One, their computers, of course, are not as hardened against cyber attacks at home as they are in the office. That's one. Two, they're not used to following cybersecurity protocols at home as they are used to following them in the office. That is another problem. So you need to provide them with training. You need to improve cybersecurity by providing them with training and funding. Training for how to follow good cybersecurity protocols and guidelines at home, and funding to make sure to have their computers hardened for the need to have virtual teams. So that's really important. Motivation engagement. Already before the pandemic, we've had a crisis of motivation engagement here in the US. Of those people, Gallup polling has shown that only 34% of all employees are fully engaged. That means they're active, they're creative, they're willing to sacrifice for the company, stay late, whatever, problem solve. Most people, over 50%, are kind of disengaged. They're passive. They're just putting in the bare minimum needed to not be fired, ready to leave at the first available opportunity. They're kind of passive, just doing that. And about 15% of the people are actively hostile. They're looking for an opportunity to leave. They're bad-mouthing the company. And that was before the pandemic. Now, what happened with the pandemic? Well, many people are, of course, transitioning to working at home. That makes it much more problematic. In the first several weeks, people are still dealing with the pandemic. There's still that kind of rush of adrenaline, excitement, rally around the company, around the flag. But over time, we're human beings are tribal creatures. This is a fundamental aspect of our evolutionary psychology. So we've grown up in those small tribes, not grown up, but our intuition, our instincts, our reactions are to orient towards small tribes. And we lack motivation and engagement when we're not surrounded by people who are doing the same thing that we are. We're not surrounded by our tribe. So this will be, of course, more difficult over time for people to be motivated and engaged when they're working from home. Plus all the other issues, all the other disruptions of the pandemic, with schools being closed, teenagers who were in college moving back home. This is a big problem. So people have to deal with this. You need to provide them with support and guidance for these issues. Not a matter of professional development, just support, guidance for how to deal with these issues. Next, effective communication. This is an important area. The people who are used to communicating face-to-face in the office have a lot of difficulty with moving to virtual communication, because virtual communication mainly takes place in collaboration platforms like Slack, like Trello, like Asana, like Microsoft Teams, and a number of others. And as a result of that, you lose body language and tone. You lose the ability to see whether somebody has an anxious face, worried face, excited face. You lose that emotional language from their body language, and you lose tone of voice. So if I say something like, I think Michael should take that project, or I think Michael should take that project, Those two sentences mean very different things, but if you write them down, they mean they're the same thing. So there's a lot more misunderstandings that happen in virtual communication. This is a matter of professional development. It's really very important to train employees in how to communicate effectively in virtual teams. Next, resolving conflicts. It overlaps, but it's not the same thing at all as effective communication. In face-to-face environments in the office, it's much easier to address conflicts. You can notice problems developing by seeing whether, again, somebody has a face that's worried, anxious, problematic, somebody seems tense. You can check in with them, what's going on, and so on. That allows you to notice and resolve problems early. In a virtual team, that doesn't happen. You can't see them. You can't see what's going on. So you can't notice the problems nearly as well. And it's much harder to resolve them because of the communication issues. This is another area of professional development. You can train your employees on this. This is doable. Next, cultivating trust. Many people don't think of this area as part of virtual team support, but it's incredibly important because in office settings, we naturally cultivate trust through just conversations, relationship building, getting together for lunch and asking what's going on with the kids, or talking about the water cooler about the local sports team or something like that, what your vacation plans. Those are all things that we do naturally in the office. But of course, we don't do those in virtual environments. There's no setting for it. There's no venue for it. So this doesn't happen naturally. That means that you need to provide a support system for this, an institution for this. You need to, again, be a trusted advisor for your leader. All of this is about being a trusted advisor to the leadership of your organization and helping them do all of these things for virtual teams, virtual support. So this is stuff that you can bring to your leadership team and tell them that, hey, these are things we really should be doing. This is not a matter of training. This is a matter of providing a venue, a support system. And I can talk about that. I've done quite a bit of this transition work for helping people develop virtual teams. Finally, accountability. Accountability is something that people think about a little bit, but not nearly enough when they're transitioning to virtual teams. In the office, the supervisor has natural accountability because they're able to walk about the office, see who's doing what's going on, and address problems, hesitations, tensions in the moment, and make sure that people are accountable. You see the supervisor walking around, you get a little bit more to work. That's kind of a natural human pattern, natural, intuitive, tribal. There's also accountability from your peers. So if somebody can come up to your cubicle and say, hey, Bob, where's that report that you were going to get me yesterday? That's something that is very hard to ignore. It's easy to ignore someone who's shooting you an email or a Slack message with that information. But it's much harder to ignore a living human being standing in your cubicle. So you need to provide accountability venues that are both the chain of command accountability venues and peer-to-peer accountability venues in virtual settings. So those are the 6 main areas of virtual teams. Those are the things you want to think about. And that's your internal business model. So your external business model, how you change your interactions with the outside world. Service delivery, relationships, managing disruptions, shifting norms, unknown unknowns, and outcompeting your competition. Those are the areas you want to be thinking about and providing support as a trusted advisor to the leadership of your organization. Service delivery. You want to change your service delivery as much as possible to virtual offerings. Socially distanced if you can, but as much as possible to virtual offerings. This is doable. A lot of people will find easier than others. You can change your professional services. There are lots of apps that allow you to deliver services virtually, much easier to do than many people think they are. You want to be creative. So for example, for me, a lot of my business depends on face-to-face interaction. I'm a speaker, trainer, consultant, coach, right? And that's what the company that I run, 6 people. Well, what we're doing right now is we're transitioning all virtual, and we're figuring out what are the best ways of delivering the same services in virtual settings and addressing all of these problems right now. So this is something that I'm doing, and this is something that a number of people are doing who are savvy about what the future holds. Now, I want to be very clear. This is not possible in all businesses. This is a hard question, but a number of businesses, it might be a better time to get out of that business, to cash out, get out, not spend your time on this. In fact, I helped a client who is the COO, she was the COO of a chain of diners in the Midwest, I think something like 24 diners in the Midwest, COO. And she realized, that I was talking to her early onward in the pandemic, that diners, restaurants in general will not do well over the next at least 2 years until we have a vaccine. So we talked about the situation, we evaluated her options, and we decided that it's going to be best for her to change her industry. So she had to go change her industry, evaluate the situation, look for a new industry where her skills would be a fit. And she recently found a position as the regional manager of a district, regional district manager of a number of grocery stores, of a large grocery chain. Now, this is definitely a move down the hierarchy from the COO of 24 restaurants to the regional district manager of a large chain of grocery stores. So, of course, there are other regional managers, but we're pretty sure that she'll move up pretty fast the chain of command because she has the experience to do so, and there's much more stability in this industry. Grocery stores are going to do well in the pandemic, and there's a lot of growth potential. So that's an example that you want to be thinking about for yourself as well. Relationships. You want to be thinking about how to, your company, you cultivate the relationships, both establishing new relationships and maintaining old ones virtually. This is a skill that's not the same as doing it face to face. Salespeople are especially find it difficult because they're so used to face interactions. The shake of the hand, the pat on the shoulder, all of those things don't work. You see each other in, at best with video conferencing, small squares on the screen, right? You lose a lot of body language, you lose a lot of tone, you lose a lot of things that you would see in face-to-face interactions. It's difficult, it's hard, it's not easy, but there are specific skills that can be developed in this area. So you want to cultivate those relationships with clients, service providers, political leaders, especially now with government stimulus funding, prospects, investors, suppliers, and this is an area of professional development. This can be developed, this is something you can learn. Shifting norms. You want to be thinking about how norms, expectations, behaviors will shift over this time. Managing disruptions first, so not shifting norms. Managing disruptions. A number of the external stakeholders with whom you engage will not be nearly as savvy as you. You're checking out this webinar, you need to plan for the long term, change your business model fundamentally. A number of them will not be nearly as savvy. So they will not plan for the long-term disruptions. You need to protect yourself and your company and the leaders who you support from their failures. You need to make a plan to do so. All right, shifting norms. So this is a good one for you to think about right now, depending on which industry. We talked about how there will be a lot of norms that will shift over this time, even if it's only 2 years, which is unlikely. You think about how your company can get ahead of the curve and anticipate these shifts, because if you can provide what the market needs ahead of what the market knows it needs, you'll be in a great position. Unknown unknowns. The pandemic was a predictable disaster. This is clear, it's obvious. There are a number of experts and not experts. So Bill Gates is a prominent, for example, person who was predicting the reality and probability of a pandemic already early onward. I think in 2017 he gave a TED talk about this. So you can predict these sorts of disasters, scan the environment for these potential disasters, and protect yourself against them. There are a number of steps you could have taken to protect yourself against the pandemic, from not simply a business continuity plan, but a long-term plan to deal with major disruptors. There are some things that you can't predict, and for that, you can build up a cash cushion, because cash is always going to be useful to deal with an emergency. It would have been great for airlines if they built up a cash cushion. A number of companies did build up a cash cushion. They're smart about the situation. Microsoft, for example, is very well known as a company that maintains a great cash cushion because they want to be able to deal with disruptions. Airlines spend their very high profits over the last decade on buying back stocks. Bad idea. They did not have a nearly good enough cash cushion. Now, this is something that the leaders that you talk to will like. You want to realize that the steps I shared will help you gain a major competitive advantage against the competition, because many of them will fail to adapt to the pandemic. And this is something you can take advantage of. This is an opportunity for you, for your company, to get ahead of these competitors who will stumble if you take the steps that I'm talking about here. So you can help your leaders, help your company seize market share in advance of the situation. So make a plan for doing so and hire away good employees from stumbling competitors. All right, these are the 6 areas of the external business model. Now, I want to talk about making an effective plan, not a plan that's perfect, ideal, yes, this will happen, and which will go wrong. This is a plan that will, in broad shape, help get you to where you want to go with the reality of the pandemic. You look at the possible futures, look at 5 years out, examine problems, opportunities, resources you need, and information that indicates where you're going. Possible futures. So you want to plan for a variety of possible futures. Don't make only a simple plan that says, this is what will happen. Think about what your business will look like, what your career will look like in a number of different futures, and invest your resources accordingly for the moderate or ideally pessimistic scenario. Optimistic scenario, vaccine by 2022. Moderate, vaccine by 2024. Pessimistic, vaccine by 2027. So what will happen to you, to your business, to your organization in 5 years in each of these scenarios? Think about that. Optimistic, moderate, pessimistic. Make a plan for each of those for 5 years. Then think about the problems. What problems might occur in each of these scenarios? List them out. Think of ways to address them in advance. So for example, if a problem that you anticipate is that let's say you work in a manufacturing plant and you work in a manufacturing company, and one of the big problems might be disruptions of supply chains when the pandemic goes much longer than you anticipate. Or if you work, let's say, in a bank, then one of the things that obviously Goldman Sachs got this wrong. So if you work in a bank, the bank might not anticipate how bad it will be, how bad the defaults will be in the long term, because the pandemic will be much longer and much worse than people are thinking it is. So in both cases, the supply chains you can address by getting more local suppliers, getting supplies built up in advance, having backup suppliers. The problem with the defaults you can address in a number of ways through various fiscal mechanisms, and we can talk in the Q&A about that. Or you can make a plan to address them if they do occur and you can't address them in advance. So that's one. Then opportunities. Think about opportunities that might come up. List potential opportunities in each scenario and think of ways of bringing them about. So for example, if you anticipate that your competitor might stumble, you can have the salespeople in your organization go to potential prospects who are currently working with your competitors and who you would like to have and say, hey, we took these steps A, B, C, D, or Z to be pandemic proof. And so if our competitor is not very pandemic proof and they stumble when they're providing services to you, we can step in and be pandemic proof and you can rely on us. And they will remember this when your competitor stumbles, and that will be an opportunity for them to come to you. Or of course, you can make a plan to seize opportunities when they do occur. Resources. Think about the kind of resources you need in each of these scenarios. Money, time, information, planning, strategic capital, social capital, whatever, all of this stuff. Think about the resources. Make a plan to reserve sufficient resources for the pessimistic scenario. I strongly encourage this. This will be really helpful for you. You can use those resources otherwise if you reserve them, but you want to reserve for the pessimistic scenario, at least the moderate one. Some of my clients have trouble, some of the startup clients, not the established ones, have trouble reserving resources for the pessimistic scenario, so we're working on the moderate scenario reservation. Don't plan for the optimistic one. This is very tempting, but it's, hope for the best but plan for the worst. And then information. Think about what information would indicate to you that you're in the optimistic scenario, the moderate scenario, or the pessimistic one. So for example, if you see the Moderna vaccine trials not going as well as would be ideal, then you can say, okay, most likely we won't have a vaccine by early 2022. Monitor this information closely and adjust your plans accordingly, depending on which scenario looks like it's happening. And then just execute, execute, execute. All right, so that's the presentation. For additional resources on this topic, please go to tinyurl.com/de-event for a free coaching session with me and 2 chapters from my forthcoming book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. This should be, the book is just out, so it's not forthcoming. But anyway, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. Check out tinyurl.com/de-event, free coaching session, 2 chapters. All right. That's what I wanted to share with you today, and I hope this has been helpful. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gleb. I confess that I am a little bit concerned after hearing some of these comments, but Nonetheless, I am very grateful for the opportunity for you to share this information and now to take some time to respond to some of the questions and comments from our participants. So what I'll do is a couple of people are writing in questions in chat and in question, and I'll go ahead and maybe read you out some of the things that have been written. So Glenn Kirk says, do you have any comments on the 1969 Hong Kong flu pandemic and the vastly different response? And I don't know if you'll have context for that specific pandemic, and if so, I can potentially let in Glenn to give us additional context for that.
I don't have too much context. I think the best comparison is the 1817 flu. That's the best comparison. And the US did not do very well with that comparison, with that situation either, unfortunately, but we had much poorer technology at that time. But something that's important to realize about studies on the 1917-1918 flu is that they showed that states and cities, municipalities that acted early onward to have strong suppression, they had better economic recovery going forward when they didn't open up too early. The ones that opened up too early had much worse economic outcomes because they had to close down later. And that proved much more of a problem. Consumer confidence took a much greater hit. People were less willing to spend money because they didn't trust their governments anymore to protect their health. So that's something that is an established finding about the 1917-18 flu that's comparable to today. And we can talk about. So I think that's probably the best to address that comment, and we can go on to other questions and come back to this if there aren't other questions. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. I know that specifically in reference to the 1916-17 influenza, the Spanish influenza pandemic that is being used as a comparison, there is sometimes a tale of two cities that I've seen in some charts where there's a comparison. I believe it's between St. Louis and Philadelphia, and talking about either an attempt at herd immunity or an attempt at suppression, and some people comparing some of the pros and cons between these different approaches. And I think a lot of days people are talking about the Swedish model today as an attempt at herd immunity.
Yeah.
Maybe while we're gathering some additional questions, maybe you can make a comment about that as well.
Yeah, Swedish model, they're actually doing really well at going toward herd immunity. What they're doing is they have a much more developed and better healthcare system than the US. So they are able to let people to not have a suppression that's nearly as rough. And South Korea also has that. South Korea didn't have nearly as much of a suppression. They were able to have their economy going. They had only 250 deaths. So that's actually a better comparison model than the Swedish one. I think they have something like 3,000 deaths by now in Sweden, which is a much smaller country than South Korea. South Korea has 60 million people with 250 deaths. That's a wonderful model if we could get there. Sweden had something like that, where they're trying to copy some elements of South Korea, and because they had a hospital system that's much better developed than the US hospital system, they are able to take more patients. So the death rate, which was in northern Italy, went to 11%, 12%. In New York City, of course, it went much higher than the 0.5 to 1%. We don't yet have final numbers for New York City, but the death rate for what happens when you don't have a very well-developed hospital system, when it's just kind of running on bare bones, where a little bit more of a surge of patients would overwhelm it, as we have very much in the US, unfortunately, going on, then all the patients who, if you're going toward herd immunity, all the patients who would otherwise go to the hospital would die. So that's the problem with herd immunity. That's what people don't realize about the Swedish system. If we didn't have that problem, then yeah, I think herd immunity would probably be the best trade-off in terms of allowing people to still work and have some social distancing, some suppression, but still have a lot of work, still have a lot of activities without overwhelming the hospital systems. That would probably be a worthwhile trade-off. But it's not up to me even. Realistically speaking, I'm not the decision maker, right? The politicians, they can't stand the headlines of the trucks full of refrigerated trucks full of bodies because their healthcare systems are getting overwhelmed. That's just the political reality of the situation.
The situation indeed has been very difficult to see this kind of news coming
Yeah.
on a daily basis. Let's take some additional questions. Perhaps it is a little off topic, but countries like Germany have contained this. Are any making better progress developing a vaccine?
I'm not sure Germany is making better progress in developing a vaccine. There's a number of countries. What the EU is doing is that they're combining forces to have a nationwide, I think there's something like an $8 billion fund to fund vaccine development. And it would be nice if the US joins it, but it doesn't look like it's doing that, unfortunately, trying to go it alone. Germany, in particular about Germany, Germany has been pretty successful at containing the pandemic. And I mentioned Germany as a case study that's quite comparable to the US in terms of size, economic might, and diversity, complexity. It's been doing a much better job because it's been much more effective in contact tracing and testing. So a lot of testing, and then finding the people who are actually sick, getting them into isolation, tracing their contacts, getting those contacts who contacted them into isolation. As a result of that, much more of Germany has been able to be open and not closed down. So the economic cost is much lower in Germany because of much better testing and contact tracing. If the US had invested, we can still choose to invest into testing and contact tracing, we can get there. And this has to be a federal response. And the federal government has so far not been willing to really focus on investing money into testing and contact tracing. So we're not following the German model. We're not following the South Korean model, which has been much more much more tracking using apps and so on. And anyway, so we're not really doing very well at all.
It's interesting that oftentimes as auditors, risk managers, internal control professionals, we think of different activities being grouped into preventive, detective, and corrective sort of buckets. And so if social distancing is a preventive measure and testing is detective and perhaps isolation would be corrective, it creates an interesting paradigm for our profession to think about some of the measures that are being done. In South Florida, there's a couple of industries that are very important, and we're getting a question that relates specifically to one of these industries. So banking, international banking, and regional banking even is extremely important to South Florida. And we are interested in getting your thoughts on specific industries. What do you see as the three largest COVID-19 impacts to the banking industry using the moderate view? All right, so the three largest impacts to banking using the moderate view.
Great. Just in terms of internal auditors, I want to congratulate all internal auditors on May being the Internal Auditing Awareness Month. So happy Internal Auditing Awareness Month for all the folks who are in internal auditing. Now going to banking for the moderate view. So that's kind of the most likely situation to happen. There are a number of impacts that you want to be thinking about in that kind of scenario. One is government stimulus, which is coming through banks, and banks are taking their fair share. So there's going to be some money coming in that way. So that's kind of one thing that you want to be thinking about. Another thing that you want to be thinking about is what's going to happen to defaults. This is going to be a huge blow to banks. They are greatly underestimating the kind of defaults that will happen. So this will be a major issue. This will be a major problem. Banks will have to deal with many more defaults than they currently think they are. They don't have nearly a big enough economic cushion planning for the reality of what will happen. So this is a big problem. Now, banks that are involved in investments, they are so a number of banks, of course, are involved in investment, stock management, and so on. Another impact is that the market is currently way overpriced because it has not factored in. I mean, it's pretty much back at pre-pandemic levels, and this is ridiculous. This is absurd in terms of the reality of the situation. It's clear that we're already in a major recession. Even if we had a vaccine right now, immediately, wonderfully now, we would still be in a major recession. The market can't fairly, accurately, appropriately evaluate the current situation as just as good as it was in January 2020. That's ridiculous. But we don't have the vaccine now, and we won't have it until early 2022 at the earliest, but realistically speaking, closer to 23, 24. So in that moderate scenario, there will be many more defaults than people are thinking, as I mentioned, and the stock market will go way down. A lot of people will pull their money out of stocks. They'll put their money into bonds, whatever. So banks will have less money to manage. They'll have less fees on that. So I'd say those three are the biggest impacts on banking.
Interesting. Dr. Gleb, I know it's 7. I wonder if you might humor us and answer just
I'll be happy to.
One final. Thank you. I think this is extremely helpful, and we're very appreciative of it. There's someone who's asking a question that relates very specifically to South Florida, and that is in South Florida, we oftentimes go through a number of planning and preparation steps for hurricane events. And does the nature of planning change for a fast-moving event like a hurricane when a slow-moving event like a pandemic is already occurring? Or should they be treated as separate events? So
of course,
clearly,
of course they should be treated as related. So when you're dealing with a pandemic, your capacity is much less, much lower. We have quarantine, shelter in place, especially if it's during a period of restriction. So right now, Florida is one of the states that's opening up, even though cases are a little bit going down. The cases will go up and restrictions will eventually need to be imposed. So if you're dealing with hurricane season, I'm guessing restrictions will be imposed in Florida, maybe, depending on how lucky we get with how less transmission of the virus there is in the summer. So far, it seems only a little bit less. Maybe we'll get lucky, I don't know. But let's say that they get imposed by September. You're still in hurricane season then. So you'll still have restrictions while dealing with hurricanes, and that will make for a much more complex problem. So you need to very much be thinking about how are you going to deal with hurricanes, flooding, various other issues, various natural disasters, not only hurricanes, of course, hurricanes, biggest issue in Florida, South Florida specifically, in the context of restrictions, quarantines, various supply chain disruptions which will happen. I mean, we're already seeing meat chain disruptions. FEMA, the federal government, is much less able to help because it's engaged in various COVID-19 activities. So you need to be able to, for your business, for your organization, whatever you're doing, and for your career, think about how you can prepare effectively for a fast-moving event while you're also impacted and weakened and harmed by COVID-19 and the restrictions with COVID-19.
Excellent. Well, that was very helpful. I believe that we could potentially go on for quite some time talking about this, but we want to be respectful of your time, and we're very grateful. So I think that you shared already some information about how people can get in contact with you. Yes, there's a tiny URL there.
Yes, tiny URL /d-event. So yes, don't have time for more questions right now, but I'm happy to have a free coaching session with whoever wants one to help them adapt this information, answer questions, adapt information to their specific context.
Excellent. And just so everybody knows, we'll also make this information available on the website and share it so that you have additional access to how to contact Dr. Gleb. Well, Dr. Gleb, thank you very much for that extremely informative presentation.